Del Rosario from L&K Clinical Research Consulting. Thank you for joining today. I'm really excited to really talk about this topic. Today's focus is trial master file SOPs, SOPs that work, ones that evolve with you, support your team, and keep you inspection ready. But before I get started, I thought it would be great to get to know who's in the room. And so in the chat, if you can tell me your role and drop maybe one emoji that describes how you maybe feel about the TMF. And that could be how you feel all the time or how you feel today, but it would be great to kind of get to know who is out there. For me, it's always going to be this. This is me. If there was an upside down heart, I would use that. But otherwise, that's usually how I do. I live and breathe it. But at the same time, there's definitely, some challenges and very things that stretch my skill set over the years. And so this explains me. But I'm trying to see what others have put in so far. Hold on. Or if they can. Can't see everyone's reaction quite yet. But that's okay. I hope that you guys, if you are a little late to the game, I just wanted to say that maybe getting to know the group that I have today, and if you can, just so that I have an idea, it's what your role is, and drop again one emoji that describes how you feel if you're able to about the TMF. But okay. So anyways, moving on. So for me, what I wanted to do today and why I thought I would do more around SOPs and cover this is what I've observed in working with organizations across the industry is that the best TMF operations that I've seen or have worked with or have been a part of have end-to-end processes, but are covered in different formats, meaning not everything is crammed either into like one comprehensive SOP or locked into super rigid procedures. And they document their TMF management lifecycle from setup to archive, but the way that it's done is it makes sense for different purposes. And I'll cover it a little bit more, but having like high level frameworks, detailed work instructions, quick reference guides, a lot of training materials. And so for me, my core message today is that TMF SOPs, especially now over the last 5-10 years, it's like it should evolve with your organization, whether you're just starting out or scaling up because you already are established. Your SOPs really can be a living framework that supports records-led TMF, flexible, actionable, and of course inspection ready. And so what this really means is that you just don't want to have to reinvent the wheel every time there's a change, when there's a new system feature that launches, and more importantly, regulatory requirement updates. You're not in a mode of having to rewrite your entire, TMF SOP, but instead you have flexible frameworks that support your teams in doing great work instead of slowing them down. So one piece before I start to kind of share my screen, because I did prepare a couple of slides to talk through things, was that there's a lot of amazing, valuable content out there for the day-to-day practices, how to file documents correctly, like avoiding, pitfalls, working collaboratively. And of course, please, for those types of tips, tactical tips, continue to apply, but just so that to preface of what this topic will be, it's really more a little different. It's not something you'll go back and apply to your day-to-day filing tomorrow. But if it is something like you're someone who's working within the TMF and you're wondering about a process, why is documentation so hard to follow? Or why does this change, have need a massive update, or it feels that way? I hope it gives you some things to think about in terms of whether it be language, approach, strategy that you can bring back to your leadership, or if you are a leader, that these are things that are, you can take away. So let me share my screen here. Okay, So wanted to introduce what I've since decided to term as the SOP spectrum, scalable for TMF. And it's what it really means is that it's a framework that LMK organically has developed or has worked with organizations who are in different stages, from startup builds, startups building from scratch, or again, established companies managing complex operations. It's based on applying best practices in records management, but also looking at lean methodologies. And it really represents what we've seen consistently work well across just different organizations, so that there's a scalable approach. And the SOP spectrum, and again, that's something, these are things that I've described when I work with, customers, clients, prospective, or just when they want to pick brain. Like I've talked about it, but I actually haven't come up with a term. And I think this was kind of like scouring through ways to term it, but it really is, it's a spectrum. And the idea behind it is that this is exactly kind of what we want to emphasize, is coming up with more of a foundational approach to TMF SOPs. So what we're seeing is that there tends to sometimes be gaps between leadership, who creates them, and of course the frontline staff or the team members who actually have to use it on a day-to-day basis. And so the struggle can sometimes either be it's overly complex, or it's too detailed that no one uses it, or it's so vague that it's not helpful. And so the concept here is that you have sort of an essential framework that encourages teams to begin with a high-level document providing essential guidance, the key core roles, responsibilities, timelines, things like that. And so an example would be like your framework SOP or your high-level SOP should cover exactly all of them. Setup, when you set up the TMF. So, and you can include things like that the TMF setup and the first iteration of the TMF plan could be a time of final approved protocol, but not 4 pages that follow like every step along the way, with configuration or setup, who does what, who does that. And then there's, of course, one around turnaround timelines to get them filed. You could, have definitions around what records should be filed at from time of collection or finalization, define it 30, 45, 60 days, but then not the step-by-step of how those records will be filed. Another could be, and what really is in the essential is the who. If you're still trying to figure that out, as as far as what your model is, you can keep it broad, at least to start, and saying something like record contributor. So there's flexibility in having a record owner and or a delegate upload. Or if you are needing everyone is meant to be hands-on, and it is the record owners that have to upload, you can sort of state that. But the how is where you can, define a little bit later, or use different methods or formats to do that. So those are just examples of what I mean by essential. And so that you're documenting what needs to happen, when, and by whom, which are the principles. And it's the how, the detailed procedures, that's where you can start to look at figuring out the best ways of where that should live. And as it's covered here, it would be, the TMF plan, the TMF index. Those can be bridging documents, and it's critical ones that capture a lot of those study-specific unknowns, or if you have multiple studies and can't follow the same exact requirements for the reasons of design, duration, complexity. That's where you can capture those unknowns, and then again, it guides the evolution of your process without requiring constant, SOP revisions. And then when you're starting out simple, and then kind of you allow the opportunity to scale, so that you are creating processes that are actionable and adaptable. So then when you get to a stage where either the organization matures, you have a better idea of what your operating or outsourcing or insourcing model looks like, you have resources to do these things, that's where you start to evolve to more of like granular components. You can then involve like the work instructions, the job aids, and training content. So pausing, because that was quite a bit. I can't seem to see everyone's chat if everyone has, oh, here, questions. Okay. Oh, it doesn't look like there's questions. Okay. Okay. Sorry. This is me working and multitasking along the way. Oh, unfortunately, we can't chat. Just submit questions. No worries. Okay. So then I guess we'll go with questions. I guess we'll take a look if there are any questions. I'll run through it so far. Okay. So the next slide, let me piece. So I wanted to kind of show how the actual approach or strategy works in practice. And so this is sort of we could do it in this way, a phased SOP framework. It's sort of an approach, again, to managing diverse functions. The TMF touches, if not all, most functions, and then the activities that happen within the TMF. So again, rather than creating one comprehensive SOP, organizations can break down your procedures into digestible, what I call either phases or modules. And what I've seen it to be is it could be like, typically you have one that's, specific to TMF setup. Then you have another one specific to records collection and processing. Then another one to maintenance and oversight, and then closure and archive. Another organization kind of approached the same way, but really aligned it to a clinical trial. So they had one that was setup, maintenance. So maintenance covered records collection, processing, and TMF oversight. And then they had one for closeout, which covered closure and archive. But again, the idea behind it is that these phases develop, maintained, and can be updated independently, and then allowing for greater visibility. So think of like these phased SOPs as modules, kind of like how a clinical protocol is broken down into appendices. You have, each appendix has like its purpose. Easy to update, easy to kind of take a look and step back, assign to different folks who have stronger opinions or feelings on certain parts of the TMF, but it keeps keeps the core protocol clean and focused. So kind of think of it in that way. And because of that, it has the potential to simplify training and onboarding, as we talk a lot about role-based training, right, as to who gets access to your eTMF and everything. This allows for that, is having these phased SOPs or work instructions allows for role-based, that maybe someone who isn't really tied to initial, setup stuff, they have already another group doing their TMF reviews. Maybe they just need to, for now, focus on getting trained on records collection and the requirements around that, and getting them uploaded. So you don't have to train all at once, or it's a situation where you've changed one portion of certain steps of yours. You're not having to train on all the SOPs, but one phase of it. So yeah. And then as your processes evolve, these modules can be, again, swapped out, enhanced, without interrupting the framework. So it really does empower your organizations to maintain, that quality, but also still adapting to changing regulatory requirements, system enhancements, and then just the reality of, day-to-day operations. Great. Let's keep it going. As far as keeping content relevant, I wanted to talk about just how to keep your procedural documents relevant. I guess since we can't use the chat and can only ask questions, I wonder if you're able to, if sort of more of a reality check, if you can type if you follow your TMF SOPs exactly, or at least close to it, or workaround if you have unofficial like sort of shortcuts. It would be good to kind of get to know that. You could put that in the questions section maybe, since we can't use the chat, it looks like. But if you can't, it would be great to know that. If you follow your SOPs exactly, or if you've had to look at workarounds for, again, sort of unofficial shortcuts, it would be great to get a sense to know that. Okay, yeah. exactly, realities, and more the reason why I'm asking. It's good to know, kind of get a sense of that. Oh, good, mostly follow. That's great. But it's exactly that's mostly. Again, that's the more the reason I ask about this. Good stuff. Follow. Perfect. Good, good, good. But it's exactly, if your SOP say one thing and your team or yourself do something different, that actually you know, has compliance exposure. And so we are, of course, measured against what is written. Sorry, I'm getting super excited to talk about this. And so there's an idea around evolving SOPs again, and when I say this, I want to be careful in the terminology. When I say and I talk about SOPs evolving, I'm not suggesting loose, uncontrolled documents or process. There's of course absolutely controlled documents, processes that we should be following with proper change management. But these are just sort of, as we know, like there's system enhancements in eTMF that tend to happen, especially for the more robust vendors, you know, quarterly. And then we know that there's regulatory changes, guidance. You may have come back from, you know, CDISC this week and have really learned a lot of things that you want to apply. And so the idea behind it is, how can you find ways to get these into your process documents, into your procedurals and tools? And so again, one of the first things that I think of is building structured feedback loops and scheduled reviews. Find some sort of like way to get the feedback. A lot of those come through meetings during your study team meeting. Some of it comes from the trends and what you're seeing in the TMF. Some are just conversations that you have with TMF folks that are the contributors and the record owners. And so finding ways to capture that and dedicating time and space to review a log of those, feedback, and looking to see where the SOPs or your work instructions are unclear, what the pain points that have been identified, and finding ways to insert them and into different formats, again, into SOPs, work instructions, using supplemental tools strategically, job aids, checklists, video tutorials. There's just different ways people learn. And so finding different formats and avenues without it having to formally update your SOP through change control every time. But that goal is like using sort of that framework so that you don't have to go through change control with your SOPs every single time. Maybe there's ways that you can lean on these supplemental tools, or again, take only one phase of your SOP or work instruction and make updates to those if it benefits the change. And when it's done, your SOPs and your procedural, procedures match current practice, the reality, and the updates are manageable and not massive rewrites. Okay, looking through questions just to see if there are any. Okay. So I've been talking more about as far as what seems theoretical and all sounds great, but how can we apply it to real world? So I thought I would wanted to at least walk through two scenarios that we've sort of, and again, I said that this has sort of organically occurred in working with organizations, but I'm walking through two that, we've worked on at LMK in the last like 4 or 5 years with, and these are just two instances and a very broad, case studies or example scenarios. And so here's one that where this organization in particular was implementing a new eTMF system, but had a challenge that maybe you can relate to, that they're, either current or what will be old SOPs were deeply embedded in their legacy eTMF system. A lot of step-by-step everything. So every screenshot, every instruction reference like the old platform. And so you can imagine you face sort of what you think will have to be an SOP rewrite situation. And at times, we know that can take, months and can delay rollout of the new system alongside, of course, more importantly, the studies that need to be in there. And so quick poll, if we can, if you type migrate, if you've gone through or are going through any sort of like eTMF or transfer migration. Looking to see what is out there if you've had. Yep. Yes. So this one in particular was going through that. But in the meantime, also, trying to implement it in-house. And then, and I didn't include it here, but in addition to that, they had also had studies where they were in the CRO's eTMF. And so they were still trying to manage that. They had an SOP that also kind of covered more the oversight aspect because the CRO was responsible for the day-to-day and TMF management. So we had to keep that in count. But I'm going to stay focused on this particular portion of them having an in-house, legacy system and then moving into a new. And so, and the reason, looks good, like quite a few of you. Yes, and paper to TMF, even more complicated. Yes, so that was what was happening. The strategy is that rather than trying to do sort of a catch-all SOP before moving forward, they really ended up following like sort of this spectrum approach with key components. They had updated and moved more towards a high-level SOP that wasn't system specific and actually made it more system agnostic, keeping the principles of the timelines and who the key players are. If they had them in particular had planned to move to having an in-house TMF operations team versus it being functional, but there were still some functions that needed to be involved in actually doing the upload. So we came into account. That was why my example is that we kept the broad term record contributor, because we knew we would have to pull that piece down in the work instructions portion of it. And so they established those principles, and then the requirements really remain true regardless of which system they used. And then specific to the studies that had to migrate, they created sort of TMF plans, study by study migration approach, where each plan sort of captured what the transition would look like, and the timelines around it, what sort of pre-transfer activities needed to occur, what post-transfer activities needed to occur, and then the maintenance around that, and what the TMF periodic review frequency for each study, because it wasn't going to be the same. Some were ending, so they had to capture that they did all of that before, and that would make sense to put in a TMF plan. And then some were going to be ongoing for some time. And so they needed to make sure that not only did they have a TMF review established right at time of, migration, but what the ongoing periodic reviews would look like. So those were things that were captured in the plans. And then from there, they also started to put together some standalone, phased procedures. They decided to go with work instructions that were system specific, so that we can ensure that the users, the team were at least successful. We built it out so that it was successful them to be able to use the new system. And so they had work instructions that they ended up using in a phased approach, so that they can tidy up and include the details, so that, again, those people that were still working in the legacy had to follow the old, but then people that were transitioning to the new, they were trained on certain portions that they needed to know and had role-based training on the procedures. And then fourth is that they created support tools, again, video tutorials showing the system interface, quick reference guides, and job aids that could be kept, so that they didn't, that they could work through those, grab those, and then those folks, because you're dealing with, studies that are in maintenance or very early in startup trying to get into the new system, they got their team operational quickly without overwhelming them with, end-to-end detailed processes, but just you had the principles, you trained everyone what you needed to. So the results was that, they didn't have any sort of delays in terms of the implementation, trying to wait for that, comprehensive like SOP. They were able to do kind of the go live adoption on time because they at least had an essential framework documented from day one, not perfect, but good enough to operate safely and compliantly, knowing that they had a roadmap ahead of them to work through these chunks. So yes, just one example of how, and the reason I can speak about this today is as we've worked with organizations, and this is what ended up, kind of working out well. And we've since worked with others who are sort of moving into that sort of model. And so, yeah, wanted to share one. And then I have one other one. Let's see, another one here. Let me try to, okay, another. This one in particular, I personally worked on this one. And of course, it's one of my sort of favorite success stories. This one was a biopharma company that implemented also an in-house eTMF in 12 weeks in terms of from the time they had already thought about it, all that, the selection, all that. Like it's from the time they decided that and had worked with the eTMF vendor to needing to really go live, they were given about 12 weeks. And so they were building it from the start, no existing sort of TMF infrastructure. They had their studies managed by the CROs. So of course they had experience in terms of what their pain points were in the TMF and what they wanted in there, but no legacy like SOPs to work on since this is their first in-house eTMF. What they had was an SOP for TMF, oversight of having it in a CRO's eTMF. So really nothing. And in this situation, including myself, like it did get to a point where I was almost getting sucked into it too. Like we can make one of those two mistakes. You either try to build that sort of catch-all SOP before a single document is filed, or you jump in with no documentation. We've seen that too, where the eTMF was implemented and then you jump in and it's just a TMF plan that will cover it. And unfortunately, that has to be the case in some ways. But yeah, they jump in with very little to no documentation, and then there's compliance chaos and questions, etc. So this organization took a different approach and was able to work alongside with them. They started with that sort of high-level SOP, truly minimum framework, core principles. What is our TMF? Why do we need it? Some of the very minimum regulatory requirements. Who's accountable? They didn't have an idea yet as to who. They didn't have the resources, and so they knew like, okay, well, everyone's going to be able to at least upload, but the CROs are going to do the doc. They'll be the ones that upload, and then at that time the Element was doing like doc approvals at minimum. They didn't have yet TMF reviews, all of that. And so there's a part of me being TMF that just did go in there and say, okay, what we need to do this, and this, and we would create it alongside and capture decisions around it, but it wasn't going to be part of this initial work. And rightfully so, because you don't know yet, like that's how it evolves. No over engineering. Can't anticipate every possible scenario. So they documented the core principles, documents, filed contemporaneously. They used the TMF plan to know like what their turnaround timeline needed to be because they weren't fixed on the 30, 35, 45, 60. And then they said essential records required upload, and completion of metadata. Kept it very, it sounds odd, but I know even as I'm saying it, but it made sense because then they put everything in the TMF plan for this initial study. And so because they knew it wouldn't change regardless of how the operations evolved. And then they created their TMF plan and index. This is where they made their initial implementation decisions, filing timeline, periodic TMF reviews, what the CRO's responsibility was, what LMK's responsibility was, and all of those. It was a large, plan, but it was what was needed. It was still documented, and they can move forward with, moving the study along. And so, again, these are all things that were study specific at the time, as they only had one study and not locked into the SOP. And so where I feel like this approach helped is that as they worked through that first study, they captured a lot of the real world lessons on top of our sort of roadmap and list of things that we needed to go through. In addition to that, we got to weed out what on that roadmap ended up being more theoretical versus real world, because they're working through those, in this one study. And so then they went to their next phase of activities, but they had to focus on implementation, getting both their internal organization as well as the CRO and LMK on board. And so they knew that periodic reviews is a big undertaking and is really, really the most critical part of the maintenance phase, other than getting the documents in. So they leaned on us to provide them that and follow our processes and our tools for the short term, as they focused on making sure everyone can get their records in, but knew that they needed something over time. So we supported them until they got to a stage that they were able to tackle that beast and create processes that worked. And so they developed work instructions where needed. They developed training materials for a lot of the common tasks. They refined their approach, video tutorials, put in a lot of metadata guidance in their TMF index, and so that there was opportunities to update without change control, and trying to put them in even a TMF plan or a SOP. So those were things that they worked through over time. And I think in general, as far as the results go, it's after that initial 12-week implementation, they were able to go live. They had enough documentation to get started. And then as they went through that entire year, they had to scale and were ready to for the rest of their studies. They didn't have to pause trying to create that perfect documentation, but they moved along with the growth. And then by year 2 and 3 was when they started to really tackle more around the periodic TMF reviews, that they took parts of what worked, from our processes, what aligned with their organization, what they know at that point, who their CRO was, how they worked, and built something that was could be successful and achievable. And then from there, they built what they learned from that year 1. And then by year 4, they actually had an EMA inspection. And when it comes to TMF oversight, especially for those TMF reviews, they had 0 findings related to TMF oversight, like procedures, because it was documented enough. They were able to show these tools that were used. Obviously, you have the process and the tools to follow it is the other piece. And so they followed it, and they created sort of a way so that they didn't set themselves up for being overwhelmed. They were able to follow those things. And so in terms of TMF oversight, they didn't have findings related to that piece because they were able to do that. But that was by year 4. And so wanted to share that. But I guess the idea behind this is, again, sometimes starting out lean can mean that you have an opportunity to adjust fast based on what's happening. And this doesn't work all the time, but this can work as long as you have the engagement to work on your roadmap and have this sort of framework in mind that you will need at some point, some sort of during the setup, startup, the maintenance phase, and then the closeout phases. So yeah, they adapted to that operational reality, I guess. And so, let's see. I think that is all I have as far as my piece. Are there any questions for this? And it could be about, it doesn't have to be about writing SOPs or what to put in, especially if you're not in a position, but more around, as far as where should you put things if you have changes, things like that. But if you have any questions, please let me know. Or maybe I can't see them, and I apologize if that's the case. Let's see. Any questions? Okay, I guess not today, or I don't know. It doesn't look like it, or unless there's something wrong with the chat. But yeah, that is really all that I had for this. And maybe I talked things too quickly, but we had about, I left it for so that we could have like 5-10 minutes. But if there are no questions, thank you for attending and listening, as always, to me talk about TMF. I appreciate the engagement as far as the polled questions. And if you have any questions, oh, hold on. Oh, okay, we do. It looks like we do. What are the major differences when writing a TMF SOP from the sponsor side versus the CRO side? It really depends on what the operating model, I talk about TMF operating model, and what that means is, you know, who owns the TMF, like who, and is it in-house with the sponsor, or is it with the CRO's eTMF using that? And so the differences there is if it's an in-house eTMF at the sponsor side, or that they own it, or the sort of the custodian, or the ones that own or are accountable. Not that they're always accountable, but if it's their side, the SOPs, I mean, it's still end to end. You still need, you know, what the setup is, what the user access is, how records are to be collected and uploaded. Then how are they maintained and reviewed throughout the duration of the study, and then you close out an archiving. So in terms of the content around it, you still need it to be end to end, regardless of if it's the sponsor who owns and manages the eTMF or the CRO. The difference is that there's other layers involved when it's not one of those. So for example, if the CRO manages the eTMF, the SOP, there should be SOPs from the sponsor side on how they will oversee it, so that there's evidence of sponsor oversight, like what levels of access. Those are things where you could, again, also start with like sort of that high level framework of the, you know, that you have, you know, a responsibility to oversee, have access, all of that into the CRO's eTMF. And then as far as your oversight and your checks of the TMF periodically, that can go in a TMF plan that is maybe owned or used by the CROs. And so that's one aspect. And if it's on the flip side, where it's the sponsor who owns the eTMF and the CROs and other service providers contribute to it, you would want to have, you know, procedures around what your operations are, how you get your documents into the sponsor's eTMF. You can lean on what the sponsor has and review it, but if there's some operational pieces in there that are not covered, it's either developing it and including it somewhere into your TMF plan if it's allowable. But if it's way too many steps, that is where you'll want to use supplemental tools, or you'll want to use like a work instruction, or, you know, because especially if it's more common than not, then you'll probably want to make it more into a work instruction, so that you can, for those types of models and, you know, studies, this is what it is. If it's not as many, maybe you don't need that. It's more of like a, you know, a quick reference guide as to a supplemental of some sorts, so that the CRO teams have a way to, you know, follow the steps that need to happen within your organization operationally, in order for it to still stay compliant with the sponsor's SOPs. Long answer. That was the long answer. Okay, so another one. Great questions. Currently updating my TMF plan template, adding in risk levels of record types. Should this be in the SOP instead? Great question. So really have to think about if it's feasible, that if you these are the considerations. If you put these record types in an SOP, I'm not sure what specific ones, but like say, you know, monitoring visit report, I guess it's really more around ensuring and vetting that that can be followed, you know, within your organization and everyone. If you're not sure yet, especially if this is the first, you know, time, I would say keep it in your TMF plan, because there's room, kind of similar to the scenario walkthrough. There is room to change that it should, if it's, you've worked through the kinks, if there are any kinks, if you have figured all that out up front, amazing. Then you can shift it to, you know, work instruction or SOP. But until then, TMF plan is the right place to put those, you know, like risk levels for the short term, knowing that you have a roadmap to put that in and time it with your work instruction anytime it's due. But that's just because there's so much, you have to have vetting and buy-in from the contributors and the frontline folks who do it. And so kind of deciding that up front sometimes, it kind of goes back to my piece of us leadership are the ones that write it, but it's, you know, the operational and the frontline staff that have to comply. And we want rules, but we also have to ensure that there's considerations around it, and keeping it lean into just the TMF plan for now until you're at a stage where you can put it in SOP is, for me, I think the way to go. Okay. Let's see, can AI or automation play a role in monitoring and enforcing SOP compliance in TMF management? Yes. I think just the system itself can be what you can consider, and I didn't cover that. Like one of the things that you can consider as part of your supplemental tools is your eTMF features. So the example that I had said about metadata guidance, right, or metadata requirements, one example of where you don't have to put that in a job aid or a, you know, index or anything, like a list of your metadata guidance, because the system itself, if you have the infrastructure to configure like the fields that you know you want required, document dates, you know, obviously classifications or artifact type, all that stuff, like that drives some of those requirements that you don't necessarily need to put, you know, in. It's the idea of like, you know, complete metadata, and then there's the system piece of it that will trigger what are they required. Now, guidance on metadata, that is where you'll still want to factor that in as a supplemental tool, whether it be a quick reference guide, a job aid. Those are like what TMF index in terms of what the dating convention should be. That the guidance around that is what you'll want to put in tools, but you can leverage your system and, you know, automation requirements to ensure that you catch some of those types of requirements. That doesn't have to be in an SOP. Like you don't have to put in an SOP. You know, these are the minimum fields that need to be included, because now that, you know, and then what if you have a configuration change and you add another one like expired dates, which doesn't have to be, but I'm just using that as an example. Are you going to go back to that SOP now, update and include, okay, this field also? So that's where you can keep it lean with metadata, you know, fields need to be entered, and then lean towards your system as well as supplemental tools. So that's one way to connect the dots in this as again, another real life example. Okay. Oh, great questions. Okay. But we are actually now a few minutes into wrapping up. And so, yeah, now I can go into my spiel. Thank you for attending and listening to me talk TMF and for all of this engagement. I wish we could have used, next time I'll look into that, using the chat feature or using, you know, emojis and things like that. But because I would have loved to get more of like your opinions, but I think these were great. I appreciate all of the engagement even today with your questions. And if you have any questions or want to learn more or talk through some scenarios that you have that similar to this of what I've covered, please reach out to me, to our LMK website. You can also send an email, even just like questions like these, an email to hello@lmkcrc.com. I'm actually going to also be at both a panelist and a moderator for the TransPerfect C3 Summit in San Francisco at the end of this month. So if you're in the San Francisco Bay Area, check out the C3 Summit website. And I think it's in all of our LMK social media posts. But if you're in the area or want, again, to just kind of learn more or have questions, please reach out. But thank you so much. Have a good rest of your day. And yeah, thank you.